Alright, so we are getting ready to hinge the elevons here. So what I generally like to do, I usually use my razor blade for this, is I like to take and cut me a strip. And none of this is super crazy precise, so don't worry too much about it. You just want your two bottom strips to be approximately the same width, and your two top strips to be approximately the same width. Bottom strip, I go for a little over an inch wide. So trim off one for each side. And here is number 2. I'm actually going to cut myself a third because that first one did not have a straight edge on it. And so this is technically number 2 right here. And there is that. And then the ones for the top edge, you want to do about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. You can do these a little bit narrower. So there's one. There is 2. So that's all we'll need for now. Set those to the side. So, the way I do my hinges, as I was saying earlier in the video, I do them backwards in process. I actually come to the bottom of the plane here, and I actually see just a little bit of laminate here that kind of popped up on me. Take that down. So what I do here is I take and overlap my laminate by about 1/8 of an inch. And I pretty much get it straight here. And then I hold it in the center. Tack that down, and then you just work your way on down to the wingtip. And then, of course, same thing, same deal on the other side. And just tack this down. And then what you want to do with this strip is at this point I go ahead and just trim off the excess. And on this end here you actually want to take and trim this parallel with your drag reducer there. And pretty much same thing with the wingtip. I generally actually taper it in slightly. That's it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this up on the back side, and again that technique I was telling you earlier about rolling it up and over that corner onto the trailing edge. And you want to make sure this is good and locked down there. Again, this is going to be your hinge, so this is where you really want to make sure you don't make any mistakes. So rolling that over, similarly to how we did this before when we were sealing up this edge from covering it from the top and the bottom. And then I just take and run this down, and I roll it ever so slightly over that corner, just ever so slightly. You don't need to go that far. So then you want to grab your elevon, and you want to make sure you get the right side, and find out, just kind of test fit it, and get an idea of where the tip of your elevon needs to be on this end here. And so what you can do is you can actually take a Sharpie marker, and the reason I like Sharpie marker in this circumstance is you can wipe it off the laminate with alcohol. And so what you want to do is you want to match it up even spacing between the gap in your drag reducer and the gap between the end of your elevon and the end of your wingtip. You want to have a little bit of gap there, so as your elevon moves up and down, it's not going to actually rub against your wingtip. So anyways, on this end, that very tip corner of your elevon, you want to put a small mark on your wing where that's going to line up. And you flip your elevon over like this, line up that tip evenly with that mark. And this is where I do it backwards, because generally you actually laminate the top first and then you flip it over to do the bottom. But doing it this way allows you to move your hinge around a little more and get it to be more flush. So then, while you squish the elevon and foam together, you want to push forward and roll that laminate up and onto your elevon. And you want to do that in the center. Then you want to do it on the wing tip. Heat it, and you want to push down with your iron, pull up on your elevon, keep it as flush as possible, roll that laminate onto your elevon as you are pushing down. And then come about halfway in between those 2 points, tack another, and then you should be able to pretty much get the rest of that locked down. And then come on to your center portion of your wing, and this is where it gets a little bit tighter. And roll that up and over your elevon again. And about halfway in the middle, do the same thing. And remember what I said about this laminate too, in that when it's heated it'll stretch. Don't worry about making this too tight of a fit, because if you do make it too tight of a fit, you can always heat it and actually stretch it. So don't at all panic if you think your hinge is too tight. And you'll already see this one actually turned out pretty well. This is already sitting pretty much flush. And so what this will tend to do is this will tend to want to have the leading edge of your elevon floating over top of your wing. But now what you could do, since you laminated the bottom, is you can actually push your elevon down flush with your wing as you're tacking on your upper level. So you can actually adjust your hinge as you're heating it. Get it exactly, and I mean exactly where you need it to be. Now if you ended up making that Sharpie mark, you want to make sure that you take your alcohol and wipe away that Sharpie mark. Unless you want it there. I don't know why anyone would, but if that's your thing, well, I'm not going to judge you for it. I've painted a couple of my planes with Sharpie. They don't look that good. So now I'm just going to push my hinge down as I tack this on, and you want to kind of push down and in, and that will get it set where it needs to be. Now if your hinge comes out and it's already right exactly where you want it to be, then great, you don't really need to do any other work with it. Just hold it in place as you tack the upper level laminate down and you're set. This particular one, I actually have to use a fair bit of pressure to get that to float down to where I need it to be. Sorry, I'm blocking y'all's view a little bit. I'll try and come around this way. So, just working short sections. Again, I'm pushing down and pushing in. Here, same deal. So you could already see how well that hinge is, and you can see how loose it is already too. See, I just decided to intentionally be dyslexic one day and do this, and ended up discovering this way actually gives you a much better quality hinge. Because one thing that some other companies will do is what's called a Z-hinge, where most commonly it's done with tape. You can do it with laminate too, but what you do is you cut 2 short sections of either tape or laminate, stick them with just a short overlap, adhesive to adhesive, so that what happens is you have a short section about that long of tape that one side is sticky, the other side is not. Flip it over, and the one side sticky and the other side is not. And basically with the Z-hinge, you stick the one side up top, fish it to the bottom, then stick the bottom side on it, and then you do the opposite on the other side. So you have the sticky side here, and then it goes down and sticks to the bottom portion of your wing. And what that'll do is it will actually roll. It causes your elevon to basically roll on your wing instead of actually be a hinge. So it's a really interesting concept. It actually makes for a pretty rigid hinge line, pretty sturdy. The only thing is, if you use tape, it can come apart at speed. So if you have a really heavy plane and you're being very demanding on it, you might possibly want to try and do something different than that Z-hinge. I've never personally had one come apart on me, but I've heard of some people having that happen. And so, now that I got this hinge here, you'll notice it's got a little bit of tightness in it now that I went all the way down. But like I said with the laminate, as it loosens up as you heat it, if I pull this down and heat just right on that hinge line, this will loosen up and you can actually stretch that laminate. And so I'm just pulling down on my elevon, and I'm using a pretty solid amount of pressure on it. You don't want to warp your elevon or crack your wood or anything, but use a solid amount like you're trying to stretch a rubber band while you're heating your hinge. And you can actually feel it start to move in some cases. And so I did that on the bottom, and already you can see this freed up a little bit more. But I'm actually going to flip over to the bottom, and I'm going to heat this hinge down here. I'm going to heat that up some. And I'm going to fold it down, a little bit of pressure, and just keep it moving. And now I've got a nice, very low resistance hinge. And my elevon, I don't know how clearly visible that is on video, but my elevon is pretty much exactly the same level as my wing. Flows straight into it. So there's no dip, there's no rise, flows flush right across to your elevon. And that is a pretty decent amount of drag that you just cut out by doing that. And so you basically repeat that process on the other side, and you've got pretty much your finished airframe. You just have to glue your motor mount and your winglets at that point, which I will show you momentarily. So what I'm doing here, I guess I should explain what I'm doing. I'm taking a little section here, this is about 1/2 inch wide of laminate, and we made our slits before when we were covering our plane, and we have these small gaps in the EPP, so we just want to take these strips and work with them. And again, like I said before, is the laminate will stretch when heated. So what you want to do is you want to use some firm pressure here, and you want to pull this laminate and force it to stretch as you're heating it, and you'll actually feel it starting to move as you apply the heat. And you can actually form this right to the shape of your corner. Now you're probably going to have a hard time getting this to wrap completely around to the other side, so I generally stop as soon as I get to that leading edge, trim it, and then I take and just lock down those corners. And then I will take the rest of my strip, tack it down, and start doing the same on the bottom. Again, you want to get a decent section here tacked down before you start pulling it, because you very well could just pull and just pull the whole strip right off if you don't have enough section behind it to actually hold it down. So again, just pull nice and firm, and you can shape it right in the shape of the corner, and then trim it off as soon as you get to the very tip of the leading edge, and slick your corners down, and you have officially sealed that one side. So I got this side here sealed, this one here has yet to be sealed. And you'll notice it does round that corner out ever so slightly, and so that'll help you out just a little bit as well. Now to get the other side. Sometimes you can clean your iron off on your pants. And don't do it when wearing your Sunday best. And again, pull with solid pressure and heat, and you actually feel the laminate moving and stretching. Get to the tip of your leading edge, trim it, and slick down your corners. And the trailing edge is going to be very similar. Only difference is we're not going to use near as much pressure because you can actually warp the foam. Alright. Again, pull nice and solid as you're heating, and really stretch that over the shape of that corner. And if you happen to have any 3mm laminate, 3mm does this really well. You can do it fine with 5mm, but 3mm works really, really well for capping your edges. So now onto the back, and you don't need to stretch the back near as much. The back should pretty much go straight on. Is. And I always cut and leave just a little bit excess that I can fold over onto the bottom section of the wing. So I just roll that on over. Alright, and so winglets, I will show them real quick. And don't lose your control rods, you'll need those as well. And so on these winglets, you'll probably see it a little more clearly on, actually you'll probably see it clearly on this side. It's hard to tell on the video, but you're going to have a small nick on the back side of your winglet that you're actually going to line up with the tip of your elevon, so that you can put both of these on very quickly and know that they're both lined up perfectly. And so to do this, you want to grab a small section of tape. Alright, and so we need to make sure our elevons are aligned. So you want to do is grab a small piece of tape, and we're going to want to tape over our elevons here. Make sure that they are lined up perfectly with the center section of your wing. And your wing will have some reflex on it, and the reflex should be the perfect amount for this plane. You really shouldn't have to trim this much. As long as your wing is true and you didn't get any warp in it, which you can check for by laying it flat on a table and coming around, for example, on the back of it, and looking across the table and looking at how high the tips of your elevons are when they're taped up with the center section of your plane, how high the tips are from the table. And on this, I'm almost perfect. I have about a 1/4 inch gap on both of them, so my plane is true. And you can do the same thing, and you want to check too for the leading edge. And you look at where your leading edge gap is, and on this one, this looks like it's slightly warped, but I can actually see that my table is actually the thing that's warped. So I know my plane is true, because I have checked it on another surface. It's actually my table that's warped on this one. But anyways, you make sure that's true. Tape your hinges down. Then you can grab your winglet and your glue. And what I like to do is I like to apply my glue on my wingtip first. And I give a pretty generous amount here. Enough to get a good thick layer on there. Then I take my finger, smear it evenly across it. And then I'm going to take my winglet, and there is a left winglet and a right winglet. The shorter arm goes towards the bottom, and the smooth side goes towards the center of the plane. So that's basically how you can tell right to left. Is if you've got one, and you're putting the smooth side towards the center of the plane, but yet you have the longer arm of your winglet on the bottom, then you know you have the wrong side. And so I'm going to line that nick up with the very, very center of that elevon. I'm going to push my winglet on. Push it on nice and solid. And then I'm going to peel it up. And now I've got the glue on my elevon, and I got plenty of that glue on the wingtip as well. So now I'm going to come over to the other side, and I'm going to do the same thing. Apply yourself a relatively generous amount of glue. Smear that in lightly, just to get yourself a good even coating. Then you grab your other winglet, line up your leading edge, line up your trailing edge, and again, make sure that nick, that little tick mark on the winglet is lined up with the center of your elevon. And once again, apply firm pressure, and remove it. And by the time you set that down, your other side will be ready to set in place. Now this glue will not be fully cured, but it will be tacked up enough that it will hold its spot on there pretty well. And so you want to place that, and I always tip it up on a flat surface and apply good firm pressure, and I kind of rock it back and forth this way, just ever so slightly, just to make sure that that's going to be seated on there just right. And then get a visual look at it, make sure that it's pretty much straight up and down. So you want to look across just like so. Make sure that it's pretty well up and down, pretty well vertical, and you are set. You can always take a right angle gauge to it as well and make sure it's perfectly vertical. If it's slightly off, it's not going to affect it that much. So don't freak out too much if it's not absolutely perfect, but definitely the straighter you can get it, the better. So again, line up the leading edge, and then roll it down and line up the trailing edge. flip it up on end, apply firm pressure while gently rocking back and forth, just to make sure that glue bites on in the largest surface area as possible. Check, make sure that you've got good vertical mounting on it, and inspecting it here, looks pretty good. And there are your winglets installed. Now we are ready to move on to our motor mount. So we can go ahead and remove our tape at this point. And now you want to find the top portion of your motor mount, and if you look at them from the sides, it's pretty easy to spot the top one. The one that tapers out smoother is the top. So for example, you can see how this one stays approximately the same thickness right till the very end, then it tapers down. This is the bottom. The one here that's really thick down here and then shallowly tapers out to a very fine point, this is the top. So what we're going to do is take a quick width measurement, and this should be right around 1.5 inches, and indeed this is a 1/16 of an inch under being right at 1.5 inches. So that works out well for us then. So what we're going to do here is we're getting ready to do our motor mount. So you want to come in, and from the seam between your wing panel and your center pod, you want to mark at 2 1/8 inch. Come down to the bottom and get yourself another 2 1/8 inch mark. Then you want to go ahead and strike a center line down your center pod here. And then from that center line, we need to make our marks for 1.5 inches. So you want to take the 3/4 inch mark, and you want to place that right over your center line. And you're going to put a mark at 1.25 inches, and you're going to put a mark at 0. Then you're going to come down to the bottom, and you're going to do the same thing. We're going to put a mark at 1.5 inches and a mark at 0. Then we're going to take and connect the dots. And forgive me a second because I'm using black Sharpie on a black plane, and it's a wee bit difficult to see. So strike a good line there. I'm actually going to make that a little bit darker. And you all probably cannot see this, but when you strike these lines at 1.5 inches, this is going to be right at about the same width as your motor mount, but slightly wider. So when you line your motor mount up, that will give you good reference lines to make sure your motor mount is perfectly straight. So now that we have those lines, you want to take yourself a razor blade, and first things first, make a mark at where the front of your motor mount is, so you know where that's at. And you basically want to score yourself a line about 1/4 inch back from those black marks that you made. And you don't want to cut very deep, you're just trying to slice that laminate. So then you get your finger under that laminate, and that's alright if you pull a little bit of foam. You want to try not to chunk it too much. And you can peel that strip right up, leaving your bare foam. And then you just come on to the bottom. And here's the great thing about the bottom. Is we'll actually get to the bottom here in a second. And so now that we have that up, we can go on ahead and apply our glue, and you want to apply this very, very generously on this mount. Don't hold back any glue on this mount. If you get some oozing out from the edges, that is great. You can always squeeze it off. You want to use a generous amount of glue, because this is the last thing you want to come up. And when I say very, very lightly smear this, I mean very, very lightly. you want to just get a good even coating of glue all over this mount. And what we're going to do is we're going to take and line up trailing edge in between our marks. Then we're going to line up leading edge in between our marks. And we're going to press this down, hold it for a second, then we're going to peel it back up. And then what we're going to do is go ahead and even out that glue a little bit more. Then we're going to take and add some more glue to our base. Again, don't be afraid to get generous with the glue. If you have some squeeze out, that's good. Alright. So now, again, we're going to line up our trailing edge. And then we're going to line up our leading edge right inside of those marks that we made, and you want to get this as straight as possible. Push that together nice and solid. And you want to support the bottom where you're pushing to, so you don't warp the whole airframe. And now that we got that, we can start to focus on the bottom. And the bottom goes a lot quicker, because what we can do now is we can pop our mount onto this upper portion here, and if you did this right, your tolerances are extremely tight on this mount. So you can push that on up top, pop your bottom mount into place, and then you can basically look from the front of the plane, line up the front of the bottom mount with the front of the back mount. And since you have that spar in place with the mount in the back, you know the back is lined up. Then you just want to take and strike your lines on the bottom, on either side of your mount. And mark the front as well. Tolerances are very tight on this one, so I am happy with that. And now you want to do what you did on the top and leave about a 1/4 inch gap in between these marks. And you just want to slice just enough of that laminate to get you a good bond between your motor mount and your airframe. Again, just pluck it up. Apply your glue on your mount. Again, be very generous with it. Very lightly even out that coating. And then I'm going to leave that motor mount on there. And you want to feed that carbon rod in. Line up the front of your motor mount. And you can always check it in reference to the top as well to make sure it's straight. Push it firmly into place. Remove the motor mount. is tack the bottom as well. So I'll pull it up. And then if you see any spots that need a little extra glue, add it in. You want to make sure that this has a good coating of glue under it, because again, the last thing you want is your whole motor mount coming off. Then you line that up with those reference marks. If you get any stringlies, they should just brush right off. It's looking pretty good. So now if you have any glue on your spars, you can pluck that off before you go ahead and glue up your mount. And so at this point, you are pretty much down to hardware and electronics install.
Sure thing, you're good.
Alright. And so at this point, you would go ahead and bolt your motor on up to your mount here. And if at all possible, it's always best if you can countersink your motor mount screws all the way flush with the back of your mount. That will make things a lot easier for you. Now, if you cannot countersink your motor mount screws into your mount to make it flush, you just want to mark out on the back of your mount where those bolt holes are going to be, and you want to just pluck a tiny bit of foam out just to leave room for those bolts to go in. And when you glue your motor on, you're going to want to take on your mount here, and similar technique to gluing all the other stuff, apply your glue, smear it in with your finger nice and even, do the same thing to the back of the mount, and then when you go to mount your motor, you simply line up those tabs, firmly push your motor into place, and that is pretty much going to hold your motor in place, and it's going to give you proper thrust angle and everything. There shouldn't be any tweaking to it. The only thing to watch out for is make sure that you have, if anything, a slight bit of upthrust. That's all you want to really make sure on that motor. But other than that, you are set and you are ready to install your electronics.